In Detmer's ninth chapter, there's a little further discussion about working with students from diverse populations. And the types of diversity have become more diverse as well in schools as we work through the last several decades. This is information that I took from a recent look at the Educational Data Clearinghouse, that the percentage of students who are white, which has for long been our so-called majority of students in the United States, and in fact the culture around which our educational system was developed. It's projected that whites will be less than 50% of students since 2014 and continue to decline as the enrollments of particularly Hispanic students and Asian Pacific Islander students increase. And so we're already in the midst of what we've always considered the majority quickly becoming the minority. And again, this very much is a regional issue. And so many of you may have had far more experience with diverse populations of students than others, but it is in fact happening at a greater rate than it has in the past. When we talk then about multicultural education as the response necessary for our changing populations, we're really talking about the use of a lot of different kinds of programs and practices that will in fact result in educational equality and equity. We're trying to provide every student that free, appropriate public education, sometimes with the most difficult piece of that being appropriate, meaning appropriate for that single individual. And in order to do that, we must become more multicultural in our practices as our consumers have become so much more multicultural. The biggest challenges are easy to understand. The impact of culture can be sometimes very insidious and very easily misinterpreted. We have to remember that culture comes down to the smallest types of behavior, like eye contact, for example, or comfort in speaking in groups. And very often we can misunderstand different cultures from our own and the behaviors that ensue from being raised in that different culture. So our misinterpretation of that then impacts our own behavior, and it can become a real challenge to meeting the needs of students who have very different values or even social interaction styles. We also know that we terribly lack a diverse teacher population in the States, and so despite a lot of efforts to bring more minorities into the profession, it's still very much the profession of typically white females in the early years and white people in general across all of the public school years of education. And that desperately needs to change. And then meeting the needs of the culturally linguistically diverse exceptional learner is a huge challenge, because once an exceptionality comes into the mix as well, it becomes so difficult to discern what is a difference and what is a disability. With communication or language, what is a different language, different phonetic code, completely different alphabet at times? What is the root of the issue, those differences, or is there in fact a disability? If the student has a diagnosed disability upon arriving to their new culture, that makes things a little easier to discern at times if you have records, but it's very difficult to even discern behavioral challenges that may be cultural versus a real disability. So, huge quandary. The use of RTI increases a lot with this population. Steps towards working together effectively. Again, we talked briefly about this already, that it's so necessary to look at our own awareness first and kind of check where our values are taking us and where our preconceived ideas are taking us. We all have bias. It's impossible not to. Biases can be negative and positive, but bias means that we have a preconceived notion that isn't really accurate because it's made ahead of the game. So we have to make sure that we're checking ourselves around what are my expectations, for example, being influenced by the feelings I have about something related to a student? Am I overestimating what they should be able to do, underestimating? Um, that kind of thing so drives the way we interact with students and the way we teach them. So it's critical to kind of take a good look at ourselves and also learn to appreciate diversity and not see it just as more work, more difficulty, more strain or stress at work, but seeing it as much more interesting classroom with a diverse population and all of the things that we can learn from one another. A caution not to focus too much on a single student from a diverse culture and constantly put the focus on them to share or to talk about the differences personally, because then they become sometimes uncomfortable with that role over and over again. But trying to have a balanced appreciation of diversity is the goal. And then one place where technology is a huge benefit here is in our ability to get all sorts of information about different cultures and different languages, and being able to translate things on the computer and get the special education forms we need in a multitude of languages and get things interpreted for us. And so, just even researching another culture, it's just at our fingertips. And so there's little excuse for us not to become as aware as we can of particular cultures we might become engaged with our students that we really have no background information about. So again, collaboration with diverse members of a team. We've already mentioned family diversity, and we talked a bit about the culturally linguistically diverse family. We didn't talk about differences in working with families in very rural or isolated areas versus urban families. Very different cultures there as well. You've probably all worked with students who move a lot, a huge detriment to their education, because our schools are so kind of independently managed, and school boards have a lot to say about what is taught and when it's taught and curriculum changes. And so moving a lot can actually make a child look as though they have an academic disability that they don't, or being absent a lot can do that as well. So recognizing the diversity of families that move a lot and all of the different sorts of school cultures those students are engaging in. The GOBT families that we will be working with, if you haven't already, appreciating that kind of diversity, being sensitive to it and learning from them. And also military families, and what comes with that often engages the family in a lot of moving, geographic movement, but also in the absence of at least one parent a great deal of the time, and the stress related to that and concern about their safety and those sorts of issues. So we can have tremendous diversity in family team members. We talk about technology. I've already mentioned it a lot. It can be really helpful. It can help us in becoming more culturally responsive, and it also brings ethical issues to bear. So when we're working with diverse families, again, as every chapter in your book does very well, and I hope you are looking at those ethical pieces at the end of each chapter, we have to ask ourselves, what new ethical constraints, if I am behaving as a real professional, am I dealing with here? And with technology, if I'm, saving very sensitive information on my computer, what do I do with it? What papers do I shred when they're no longer needed? What do I share with colleagues? What is necessary to share and what is really unethical to share? So with collaboration, and if you've built rapport and trust and there's a lot of sharing going on, with that comes a great deal of ethical responsibility.